Hello, everyone. This may be a very long screencast. I'm going to try and keep it as brief and as concise as possible. But this is the third bullet point of attachment. And it's, as I say, it's a biggie. Whereas in the last bullet point, you only needed to know two studies, relatively simple ones. Here, you need to know two quite relatively complex theories that have quite a lot going for them. So the two theories you need to know are at the bottom of the screen: Bowlby's monotropic theory and the learning theory of attachment. Now, this is the first of two Bowlby major Bowlby theories that you need to know. The next one being Bowlby's maternal deprivation theory, and you need not to get them confused, which some students do. Mono, for those of you who I will ask later on, mono means one. So Bowlby's monotropic theory is this idea about there being one primary attachment figure in a child's life, which he believed to be the mother. It's a very controversial theory. I wouldn't say it's too believed nowadays. There are parts of it that are good, but this idea about one primary caregiver is quite controversial. But we're going to start by looking at the learning theory of attachment. So in order to know about the learning theory of attachment, you need to be able to recall what the learning theory is. And so one thing I will be asking all of my classes to do is to recap these terms here. Just a few terms from behaviorism/learning theory: conditioned stimulus, conditioned response, operant classical conditioning, and law of effect. But let's make a start here then, right? So what does the learning theory actually suggest? That you learn your attachments through reward, punishment, and association. You do not have any biological, I'm going to put that's quite off-putting that. You do not have any pre-programmed biological hardwiring to attach onto something like Lorenz's geese did, for example. This learning theory, which may be wrong, believes that you essentially learn to be attached, right? And you learn to be attached according to a few things, right? But we'll go through those. It's also known as cupboard love theory. So the second part that I guess you really need to know about learning theory is, how do we learn attachments? Through food, mainly. Through food. We associate food with pleasure, and I think every student can get on board with that. Actually, no, most students can get on board with that. We associate food with pleasure, the vast majority of us. The more times our mum or dad feeds us, we slowly associate that pleasure with their company. And eventually you get the middleman out of the way so that when you see them, you are happy, and thus you have gained an attachment. Controversial in its own ways, but essentially the learning theory states that all children are blank slates. And therefore, the sun has just come piling in here. All children are blank slates, and they will learn their attachments from their environment. Okay, so this is primarily what you do need to know. I'm going to go through this on the left-hand side, just going to read it out. And we're going to go through step by step, because this is really the crux of the theory. According to classical conditioning, food produces pleasure, which we know. Right, and that is that first one. As you can see, food before the conditioning, food, which is the unconditioned stimulus because it has yet to be conditioned, has yet to be associated. Food will always result in pleasure, i.e., a happy baby. So an unconditioned stimulus will always lead to an unconditioned response, right? And this happens importantly before conditioning. Slowly but surely, the child simply associates these two together, right? And eventually, you can cut out the middleman, in this case, food. And after conditioning, what you've got is a conditioned stimulus will always have an automatic, involuntary, conditioned response in the child. So every time the baby sees the mother, which is the conditioned stimulus, it will result in a happy baby. And it does this through pairing the neutral stimulus, which at the beginning is the mum. Why is it called the neutral stimulus? Neutral means, non-emotional, I guess. It means in the middle, don't really mind. Because at the beginning, you don't have any strong feelings with your mother. You don't have, let's not go into Freud just yet, but you don't have any associations with your mother, and then eventually you will pair this neutral stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus. So let me use not an analogy, but an anecdote here. Bella, my loving cat, is not there. Every time me or Candy will go to a particular cupboard with her food in, she will jump up and start to get really excited because she has associated that cupboard with food. She's also associated, particularly because I've had Bella now at the time of recording for over 2 years. I've fed her since she was not a puppy. What are they? Kittens. That's the one. I've fed her since she was a kitten. She has associated food with pleasure initially, but now she's associated that food and that pleasure, that good feeling, that happy cat feeling with me. So that she will, when she sits on me, she purrs. She has an attachment to it. It's a two-way attachment. Now, obviously, it's not as complex as a human child, but a furry cat child. That's how Bella has learnt her attachment. Now, funnily enough, we've just come back from holiday and we didn't see Bella for 3 or 4 days. All of yesterday, Bella was actually in a really good mood the whole time. She was in a really good mood because she missed us. And that's not me being deluded, by the way. That is not me being deluded. That's not me saying that my cat loves us. Maybe the cat doesn't. But she was unnaturally happy yesterday. She was purring on my lap, for example. She was getting really comfy. She was following us around, which she does quite a lot of the time anyway. That's a good way to know that you've formed that attachment. And what I'm saying here, or what the theory is saying, we've learnt that attachment. We've learnt it. Now, there's a couple of important bits to add to this, really, I think. It's two-way. It's two-way. Now, I'll come on to that in a second. I am getting a lot of, how to say, I'm getting a lot of reward from feeding Bella because she's not meowing anymore. She not being annoying, not following me around, and she's getting it as well. So both people are benefiting. That's an important part of learning theory. Attachment can also be learnt through operant conditioning. So everything we've covered so far, this is just the classical conditioning part. This is really important. Learning theory has 2 parts to it, operant and classical conditioning. You need to be able to talk about both in the context of attachment. So what we've covered here is classical conditioning, how you associate people with pleasure. But it can also be learnt through operant conditioning. The presence of the caregiver is reinforcing. The infant gains pleasure or reward as they are being fed. So it's all about that pleasure. It's all about that reward and that punishment as well. Punishment is a way to stop attachments being formed. I don't know why you would want to do that. So the behavior of the infant is reinforcing for the caregiver. So a good example, a brilliant example of this, by the way, is if I were to start playing, and I'm going to do this in class really loudly, if I were to start playing a sound of a baby crying, high-pitched, horrible, goes down your spine, not very nice. Like, you're literally there, like some people don't mind it. These are psychopaths. But negative reinforcement is also quite important here, because a new mum or dad will hear the baby crying in the next room and they will go to the baby to shut the baby up by feeding it. So that's negative reinforcement. You're doing a behavior to adopt a behavior in someone else. That's negative reinforcement. So not only are you positively reinforced because, look at this picture just here. You're feeding the baby. It's in your arms. It's looking up with you with those big eyes. It's, drinking human breast milk or whatever you're giving it, and it's looking up at you, and maybe it smiles, maybe it like giggles, for example. You've got a happy baby. That's going to warm your heart. You're positively reinforced by feeding the baby, but you can also be negatively reinforced, and you need to be able to argue both sides to that as well. And that's what I mean by it's also a reciprocal thing. The caregiver actually gets something out of the attachment. If it's positively reinforced, it gets that lovely warm heart, by looking at their kid, presumably their kid, and getting that like, oh, it loves me, right? Or it's looking up at me. It's got big eyes. Look how beautiful. Look how cute my child is. But it also gets. So yeah, basically, caregiver and infant are rewarded. And the law of effect, I think it's next. Whatever. The law of effect is any behavior that results in pleasure or reward is likely going to be repeated. So if both caregiver and infant are being rewarded for, let's say, feeding the baby, right, the caregiver gets rewarded and the infant gets rewarded, you're much more likely going to strengthen that attachment going forward. You might turn around to me and say, yeah, but I hate my mum, I hate my dad. You probably didn't hate them at this time, right? You probably didn't hate them at this time. Now, it does have face validity. If we haven't covered face validity yet, face validity is on the face of it, does this theory make sense? Right? Forget all the scientific, research or whatever. Just does it look like it makes sense? Food is pleasure for most people. That's an indisputable fact. Food is pleasure for most people. I'm still picking out the crisps I've just eaten, and it's nice cheese and onion. But I think this is too simplistic to explain something as complex as attachment. So there's other parts of this. I'm just going to speed this up a little bit because I'm taking too long. The learning theory largely suggests that attachment is driven by food and its associated pleasures, not comfort, like Harlow said. So this theory is already discredited by Harlow, who said that actually comfort's more important than food. But obviously you can criticize this because it's monkeys we're talking about. But I also want you to consider the further aspects of this. Any idiot can feed a child. Anyone can feed a child, which suggests that actually the mother or father, one is not better than the other. That's a consequence of this theory. It's saying that anybody can be the major attachment to a child. If the dad can determine the child needs feeding before the mum, and the dad feeds the baby quite a lot, then the dad will probably, and gets it right, by the way, it correctly figures out that the baby wants food, then the dad will be the primary caregiver. If the mum does it, then the mum will be the primary caregiver. So this is, I would argue, a more non-offensive theory than the one we're going to cover, which says that actually the mum is the primary caregiver. The learning theory is much less offensive in that regard. And you need to be able to argue how, and I don't know if we've covered this term yet, that the learning theory is not particularly socially sensitive. That's really important. That is really important because we'll go into how insensitive the monotropic theory is actually regarded. Before we go into the brief evaluations, please, if you're backing this up, do not talk about Pavlov or Watson and Rayner. They did sweet nothing for attachment. They did a lot for learning theory. Well done on that. But they did almost nothing, literally nothing, for attachment. So you need to be careful because the question you're going to get in the exam is going to ask you, describe and evaluate the learning theory of attachment. And if you're wanging on about Pavlov and Watson and Rayner, then you're going to get nothing, right? So you need to stick to pieces of research like Dollard and Miller. Now, I'm not going to go through this in too much detail. You feel free to pause the screen, because I'm a bit worried about time. But Dollard and Miller are really the people who they applied learning theory to. Sorry, I've just got to turn this around because the sun blasted me in the face. Attachment. They applied learning theory to attachment. Fantastic. They extended the theory to explain that the attachment is a two-way process. Fine, we've covered a lot of that already. Now, in terms of evaluations, there are some pretty key ones just here. Let's go with the first one. This theory is too simple. It's too simple. You realize how complex your attachments are, especially as a kid. You're fed 2,000 times a day. No, you're not. No, you're not. You're not fed 2,000 times a day. You're fed 2,000 times in the first 2 years of your life. So on the one hand, you can kind of see how you would make an association with that. It took Bella maybe 2 weeks. 2 weeks, I'd say, to make an attachment to me because I was the one feeding her. So you can kind of see it. But attachments are incredibly complex. What happens if the mum solely feeds the kid? That would mean it's impossible, by this theory, for the dad to make an attachment. Yet that doesn't happen. The dads do make attachment. So this theory has lowered explanatory power. It's quite narrow-minded. It refuses to consider other factors, like other environmental factors. It's not just food. Surely it's not just food. Surely you're attached through play, right? And also, can I just point out this? You have quite strong attachments to your friends. Yet your friends don't feed you breast milk or something. They don't feed you, yet you have the attachments. So there must be other ways in which you actually make attachments. So this theory is quite parochial, it's quite narrow-minded. Bowlby, on the other hand, said that actually food isn't important, and we'll come on to that in a second. But this is the real term that you want to really go for. This theory is environmentally reductionist. It reduces, and it's quite similar to this first point up here, it reduces a complex behavior down to one single variable. Right? In this case, association of food. Attachments are far too complex, and therefore cognitive factors are not taken into account. What happens if your mum feeds you but you don't like the food? What happens if your mum feeds you but you don't like the food? This theory doesn't take that into account. Not really, anyway. And Schaffer and Emerson actually refute the learning theory, finding that, and we've covered Schaffer and Emerson, so you should know this already, that babies are not necessarily attached to those who feed them the most. 39% of babies are not attached to the person who feeds them the most. That's a good statistic to know. 39% are not attached to the person who feeds them the most, suggesting there must be other factors involved. Okay, there are a couple of evaluation model points here. You may want to pause them and go through them. This one is how I would want you to write a point about environmental reductionism. And you have a couple of questions there as well. Now, that's not the only theory we need to go through. We also need to go through Bowlby's monotropic theory. And a reminder again that the monotropic theory is this, mono meaning one, means that Bowlby believed that a infant will have a primary attachment to one parent. And he said that was mostly the mother. Now, nowadays, this is actually seen as quite socially sensitive. It's been used quite a lot in court to show how outdated attachment theories are. It goes against the recent push for equality, because if you're saying one parent is better than the other, or more important than the other, that obviously goes against equality. But we need to go through it. Because whilst some of Bowlby's ideas are highly offensive, Some have stood the test of time, although maybe not the monotropic side of things. So let's start with this. One primary attachment, which in most cases is the mother, and here's the one of the most offensive parts. The other attachments, including the father, are minor and have little effect on the life of a child. Now, I know for a fact I've probably got some students who live with their single dad. Either mum has died or divorce, and you opted, or maybe you were made to go live with your dad. And a lot of you may be looking at this deer and thinking, well, what does that mean? What does that mean? We'll cover that in the next couple of weeks, but yeah, we'll cover that in the next couple of weeks. Already quite offensive, already quite socially sensitive, but there's Bowlby is what I call a circle theory. It's a collection of loads of different ideas. It's not like a stage theory where you go stage 1, stage 2, stage 3. It's a collection of loads of ideas. Now, Bowlby was heavily influenced by this idea about the critical period. And he said, and you need to note this down, the critical period of infants was 2.5 years. If they do not make an attachment by 2.5 years, you are socially, cognitively, developmentally deficient. You're not going to catch up, basically. So it is an evolutionary idea. And I want you to think about this, particularly females. You grow, or most of you will grow little teeny tiny zygotes, embryos, fetuses, babies in your womb for 9 months. 9 months, during which time you can't do a lot of stuff. And at the end of it, if we're talking evolutionary times, you are at risk of serious injury or potentially death, right? It doesn't really happen nowadays, nearly as much as it used to, but that can happen. There was a story a couple of years ago, which I tell my students, in the African savannah, where a ranger left her baby with a nanny. The nanny let the kid get a little tooth. The kid was about 2 or 3 years old, about the size of the baby on the screen. The nanny let the baby get a little too far away from her. In the bush, there was a big cat waiting, as in a jaguar, a cheetah, a leopard. I think they're all cats. One of them might be a dog, I don't know. Who jumped out, grabbed the baby by the head, ran off, and they only ever actually found the skull. Now, that would never happen. That would never have happened if it was the baby's mum, because we have evolved to go through 9 months of creating this baby, putting our life at risk. Why the hell would we then let it go into danger? If that happened, you'd be like, what a waste of my time. What a waste of my time. So what we have learned to do, particularly females, according to the monotropic theory, is we've learned to keep the baby close to us. That leopard, that jaguar, that cheetah would never have attacked a full-grown human, especially in a group of humans as well, would never have attacked them. It's gone for the baby because it's easy prey. It never would have gone for a full human. So we have learnt, and by the way, when I say learnt, it's become ingrained in our biology. This is genetic, it's evolutionary, we're born with this. So we have evolved to keep the baby close to us. That's where it comes from. Because we think we want to keep our future secure. We want to keep our genetic ancestral line going. We want to keep that going. And therefore, we need to keep the baby close to us. And because we've kept it close to us, we've developed attachments from an innate biological point of view. That was a long explanation there. Social releases are also quite important as well. A big part of the theory is that children have attachment-inducing behaviours called social releases. Now, social releases are things like crying. They are things to get you to go to the baby, right? And therefore, attach yourselves to it. Crying is horrible. We've evolved to find it horrible, by the way. We have evolved to find it horrible. Looking, smiling, i.e. looking cute to maintain parental attention, It is quite known that new parents struggle to stop looking at their baby. They will watch it breathing at night, for example, because they find it cute, and so this attachment, it is attachment inducing. The other one is to follow the parent as well when the baby can move. I've heard it said by a few friends kind of in the last kind of 10, 15 years, just how life becomes very different when the baby's able to start moving. Parents celebrate this a lot of the time and then realize that they're going to get absolutely no time to themselves going forward at all, especially if you're home by yourself. So the baby will follow the parent to maintain that closeness. There could be jaguars around, so it maintains that closeness. These behaviours are displayed at a very early age and they become focused on a few people. We know this from Shaffer and Emerson. It's mainly the parents. But here's the important thing. This only happens if the parents respond in a meaningful way, if they show sensitive responsiveness. And we've talked about this before. Sensitive responsiveness is the ability to really understand what your baby wants. Does it need burping? Does it need feeding? Has it shit itself? Does it just want to be close to you? Mums and dads will vary in their ability to have sensitive responsiveness. Generally, females are better at it, but that's like saying all boys are taller than girls. Generally, that is true in terms of average, but are there some females who are taller than some males? Absolutely there is. Are there some males who have better sensitive responsiveness than females? Absolutely there are. So that is what... Let me ask you this. If your friends didn't respond to you in the way you needed, would you be friends with them? Say your boyfriend or girlfriend breaks up with you and you go down to your friend and you say, I need a hug. And they give you a slice of pizza. Would you be attached to that person? No, you wouldn't, because they're not responding to you in the appropriate way that you want. Now, babies can't communicate, and mums and dads have to figure out what it is after. Couple of important points here, but not necessarily crucial. More so if you're going to struggle to be able to write about this in your AO1. But useful to use, I guess. As I said, Bowlby believed in the critical period, 2.5 years, you need to know. But probably the main part of his theory is the internal working model. I actually do really believe in an internal working model. An internal working model, and I'll try to describe this slowly before I show you the definition on here. An internal working model is your template from your primary relationship that you use on all of your other relationships. So I know we haven't talked about like types of attachment yet, but let's just say you have let's say you've got an avoidant relationship with your primary caregiver, your mum in this case. An avoidant attachment is one where you like to keep emotional distance between yourself. You don't like people getting too close, for example. You feel uncomfortable about it. You're not clingy, for example. You're very independent. Let's say you have that type of relationship with your mother as a 3-year-old. You will take that template and you will use it on all of your friends because you believe that's what relationships are supposed to be like. The internal working model, and this is a good way to phrase this, allows people to make quick duplicates, and it's basically a schema for how they think relationships should be. I've seen this before. I've had resistant kids before who have very tumultuous relationships with their mum and their dad. They're very, clingy, love you, very intense with their relationships. One minute they're very much, I love you. The next they're very much, oh, I hate you. But they're really, really intense in their relationships. They have those relationships with everybody. So the internal working model is a template for all future relationships. and all current relationships as well. That's pretty much the AO1 for Bowlby's monotropic theory. As you can see, there's a lot here. There is a lot. Infants have an innate drive to survive, and what that means is they do not learn to try make attachments. It's ingrained in them, right? So you can see how this and the learning theory are different. A couple of evaluation points. Contrast it with the learning theory. Easy. What could you contrast it with the learning theory on? Nature, nurture. Bowlby is nature and nurture, whereas learning theory is just nurture. They differ in their amount of social sensitivity. So you could argue that whilst they are both socially sensitive to a degree, the monotropic theory is far more offensive than the learning theory. The other thing about this, by the way, imagine if we truly believed the monotropic theory. Realistically, all mums would have to stay home, for the first 18 years if you're raising your kids? That's what the monotropic theory is saying. It's suggesting that mothers have to stay home. They have to stay home and they cannot go back to work. Now, if that was true and half the workforce left the British economy, it's not an exaggeration to say the economy would literally collapse on itself. So we need to be careful in interpreting what Bowlby suggested. There is a bit of evidence with Lorenz and critical periods, but again, that's pretty weak. That's pretty weak in taking geese and applying them to humans about the critical period. And I guess the main evaluation here, Shaffer and Emerson have already shown that you can have multiple attachments. Shaffer and Emerson have said you can have multiple attachments, and some of those multiple attachments can be just as powerful as your primary attachment. So there's a lot there. My favourite point is this one down here. Right, implications for the economy. I don't know if I actually talk about this. No, I don't. But this is actually quite an important point that's not there. I'll go back. Bowlby did do some good. A positive of Bowlby's theory is the highlighting of the need for improved facilities for parents at hospitals, for example. So, for example, despite funding issues with the NHS, hospitals still provide dorms for parents of severely ill children to be able to keep that attachment strong. You know, it literally used to be, if you had an ill kid, you'd take them to hospital, be like, right, I'll see you later, or maybe I won't. You know, maybe you won't make it through. See you later then. And they would just come pick the child up at the end. Nowadays, that doesn't happen because you're able to stay close to the kid and keep that attachment going. You're not abandon that kid to the hospital. And so Bowlby, the reason why we have these dorms is because of Bowlby. Almost single-handedly is because of Bowlby. A couple of questions just here that are probably quite useful to know, but I'm not going to go through them. Feel free to pause the video if you wanted to have a crack at some of these questions. But that is it. Like I say, hefty bullet point, two big theories. You need to be able to evaluate quite well. See you later.